Well, good morning, everybody, wherever you are on the planet, joining us for this special event. Our keynote speaker, Gary Lachman. Imagine if a renowned songwriter wrote a song about Swedenborg's signature concept of correspondences. Well, it has happened in a sense, and we have that songwriter and author with us to talk about the language of correspondences. Gary Lachman is the most recent book-length biographer of Swedenborg, who also happens to be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, something none of the other dozen or so book-length Swedenborg biographers can come close to in matching cultural cachet. Gary's adult life divides into two fascinating but overlapping dimensions: careers and geographies. His first geography and career was as a guitarist and songwriting American rock and roller when known as Gary Valentine, and when he shared the stage with the American pop rock band Blondie, Iggy Pop, and many others. His second geography and career has been unfolding as a prolific and applauded author living in London for the last 25 years. His astonishing output of a book a year ranges across a considerable contemporary landscape, venturing deeply and widely into the veins of cultural trends, alternative spiritualities, and Western esoteric religions, in which Swedenborg has popped up often. As such, his body of work as an author situates Gary amongst another elite band, if you will, that of serious authors who understand Swedenborg's historical context in quite skillful and complex ways. You can find Gary's works in online bookstores such as Barnes & Noble and Amazon, and you can purchase his newly, just this spring, released volume on Correspondences by going to the website of our London publishing house friends in London, the Swedenborg Society at swedenborg.org.uk. We may have time for a little Q&A in this session. Those of you who are in on the Zoom webinar platform will see a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and I will moderate the Q&A time such as we might have it. So welcome, Gary, to our annual gathering of the Swedenborgian Church of North America back in your homeland. And thank you so much for dropping in from London to be with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Jim, for that introduction and for the invitation to speak to you all. It's late afternoon here, getting on to evening, but it's summertime, so you know, the sunlight up to about 9:45. So it's not quite the Arctic Circle, but close enough. But yes, I'm going to speak about Swedenborg and his ideas about correspondence. And let me see, get to share screen here, and bear with me a moment, and we will get to this. Happening now? Okay, there we go. All right, can we all see this? Yes, I had well, I mean, I'd first come across Swedenborg many, many years ago when I first got interested in all of this sort of thing I've wound up writing about over the past 20-something years or so. And that was in a book, well, it was a book called The Occult by Colin Wilson, and he wrote about quite a few different people in there, and Swedenborg was one of the ones who popped up in there. And but more recently, when I started writing about this sort of thing, I was asked to do a book about literature and the occult, basically writers who had been influenced by the occult. And many of the 19th century writers I looked into, and some in the 20th century as well, I mean, they had all been influenced by Swedenborg. I mean, I'm sure you know this, but we'll get on to some of them. And that was how I got sort of into it. And then I was asked by the Swedenborg Society some years ago to write a book, basically a short intro kind of biography about Swedenborg. And as you say, yes, I'll be talking about this. It's a slim volume. It's a longest essay, specifically about Swedenborg's ideas about correspondences. And it's in a series that the Swedenborg Society is doing, is Introducing Swedenborg. And the book I had written for them some years earlier was Discovering Swedenborg. So we've discovered him first, and now we're introducing him, and now we're going to get on to the notion of correspondences. And what are the correspondences about? Well, in a way, I feel like there's a phrase here they have in England, it's bringing coals to Newcastle. I feel like I'm selling Swedenborg to people who know about him probably much more than I do. So you probably don't need me to lecture you too much about correspondences. But the central idea is some correspondence between the earth and the heavens, and I just picked out a generic sort of image there to give that idea. But what I'm going to look at more than, say, tell you what correspondences is about, we'll get on to that, is the cultural impact or the historical setting. And you might not know, or you might not be aware. I mean, you probably assume that Swedenborg's ideas about correspondences, they came about in a religious setting, a sort of hermeneutic that he used to understand scripture. So you would think they might have some impact in the religious area and, spiritual, something like that. But they actually had a wider ranging impact, and not too long after his death. So he dies in 1772. By the time of the French Revolution over here, Swedenborg's ideas are being politicized. They're being blended with some of the ideas of Franz Anton Mesmer. And for folks who don't know who Mesmer was, he was a German healer, scientist, doctor, but at this time there were still notions of a kind of, well, his doctorate was in astrology and the effect of the planets on health. And he maintained a sort of an idea of that. We have this word called mesmerism, which we associate with hypnotism, but it's actually, hypnotism rose out of Mesmer's work, but it's actually rather different, because Mesmer believed there was an actual kind of fluid, a sort of energy, a kind of tenuous something or other that he called animal magnetism. And in many ways, it's something that Swedenborg talks about as well when he writes about the vital economy and animal economy and things like that when he's writing about the body in his scientific works. But Mesmer had this notion that this animal magnetism, this kind of cosmic energy, ill health, sickness and disease brought about by a kind of blockage of it. And he developed this whole system of applying this kind of animal magnetism that he himself learned how to sort of use and manipulate to his patients. And this brought about a kind of strange sort of fit in them, where they would have this kind of eruption, a kind of orgy, a strange kind of release, catharsis. And these ideas of physical health involving a kind of catharsis got transposed into society. And Mesmer's ideas got linked with Swedenborg's because Mesmer's patients and people who applied his methods, people would go into a trance. And this was how hypnotism came out of it, because there wasn't any sort of animal sort of fluid or anything being projected onto them, Svengali-like kind of hypnotic effect. It was putting the people into trance as they sort of followed the hands, making magnetic passes and all that. And those trances became associated with spiritualism and became associated with Swedenborg's own inner voyages to heaven and hell and all that. But the punchline of this is that the notion that just as in the patient, a kind of catharsis was necessary to bring about health, so too in society. And you had these societies of harmony all over France before the French Revolution that were blending Swedenborg's ideas with Mesmer's on a political scale. And then you also have the artistic or the cultural, the poetic, choose Charles Baudelaire, who's, the probably public enemy number one in one sense, if you want to think in terms of someone who adulterated Swedenborg's ideas about correspondence, and we'll get on to that. But his influence was far and wide, inaugurating the whole aesthetic movement of symbolism that was one of the most powerful, if not the most, in the second half of the 19th century. But even beyond that, in more contemporary terms, we find Swedenborg's ideas turning up in the whole realm of new thought and sort of positive thinking, specifically his notion of the law of attraction, which turns up in the very well-known Secret by Rhoda Byrne, which earned her quite a bit of money. And in a way, it's a reversal of Swedenborg's ideas of law of attraction, as far as I understand. Because they have to be passed out of bodily death. We move into the spirit realms, and then depending on our true affections, what we really want, we are either attracted to heaven or to hell. And so law of attraction is not so much that we attract things towards us, that we are attracted to, either heaven or hell. And this was something that was picked up by Andrew Jackson Davis, who was one of the great American spiritualists of the 19th century. But what did Swedenborg mean by the Correspondences? Well, fundamentally, it means that everything in the world, everything around us, in the natural world, also the man-made world, relates in some very specific way for Swedenborg. It's a one-to-one sort of relationship, and this is one of the things that will happen to this idea of correspondences once it gets thrown into the sort of the cultural pool out there. But everything relates to a higher realm of being. The spiritual, the celestial realms. We'll get on to some of the other ways in which a similar kind of notion of higher realms of being were articulated. And we can say with the poet Goethe here, who was a great reader of Swedenborg, and like Swedenborg was also a scientist, and read Swedenborg's works on science. But he said that in his great poem, poetic drama, Faust, alles Vergängliche ist nur ein Gleichnis. Everything that is transitory is only a symbol. So the passing temporal world, the world I can see outside my window, of trees and clouds and other natural sorts of things. This is a likeness, this is a symbol. This is a reflection of another deeper reality that is not transitory, that is permanent. And this was something that William Blake, as we all know, a great reader of Swedenborg, who argued with him quite a bit and wrote some very, very powerful poetry in the process of doing that. He too said that the natural world, which he called the vegetable glass, it is in that the realities of eternity are reflected. And if you know your history of philosophy, this was a direct refutation of John Locke's belief that there is nothing in the mind that didn't get there first through the senses. It's a complete turnaround. It's the traditional view, but that view had lost a lot of ground by this time to the rising, more scientific, rational, empirical view. And Locke's view is that, no, we're born tabula rasa, we're blank slates, and outside experience has to imprint something on us, it has to write something on us. And Blake is saying, no, it's the other way around. What we see out there, they are reflections of well, Jung would call it archetypes, and Plato would call them the ideas or something. But it's as I say often in my talks, Locke's idea is that we're born and we're like an empty flat or an empty apartment, and we have to go to IKEA and buy a bunch of stuff, and then we bring it back, and then, oh yeah, the flat's furnished and all that. And what Blake and Plato and Goethe and Swedenborg saying, actually, no, we're born, it's not just a flat, it's a mansion, and it's really, really well appointed and all that, but we just don't know all that sort of thing. And on to Czesław Miłosz, who is a great Swedenborgian and also a relative of an earlier great Swedenborgian, O.V. Długosz Miłosz, who was a Lithuanian poet and diplomat who wrote in French and wrote these fantastic long poetic epics in which he expresses quite a bit of Swedenborg's ideas. And he says that for Swedenborg, the world is, it's all an alphabet, it's all language. It's a text that we have to learn how to read. And it's very much like Goethe is saying, and Blake is saying. And someone else who is saying that, we'll get back to again later on, is Henri Corbin, the French. He's most known as a scholar of Persian mysticism. He started out as a phenomenologist. He was one of the he translated Heidegger into French, one of the first translations. So he's coming from that tradition. But he talks about a kind of spiritual hermeneutics, in the sense that hermeneutics is the practice of understanding something, starts with reading text, starts with reading biblical texts. And obviously, this is what Swedenborg is doing. But we can also perform the same kind of deep textual reading on the world itself. So there's this notion that the world around us is just not simple. It's not, as we'll go on to, as Gertrude Stein said, a rose, a rose, and a rose. What we see with the senses is fundamentally the first kind of steps on a kind of ladder of being, levels of being. And the world that we inhabit is a reflection of a higher one. And this is in Swedenborg's system. This is kind of a very generic, more or less fundamental blueprint of what we can call this kind of hierarchy of being, a great chain of being. It's also a very stripped down diagram of what's known as a kind of emanationist ontology, emanationist cosmology, where you have at the top level some fundamentally non-manifest, perfect kind of world, whether it's God or the divine or the absolute. And then through a series of sort of emanations in the way that the sun emanates its light, different levels. And this is the sort of the Neoplatonic one, and here's the one which we can't really say much about. It serves the same. It's in the same place as the Pleroma in the Gnostic, or the Sunyata in Buddhism, or the Ein Sof in Kabbalism, or the Neti Neti in Hinduism. It's some fundamentally transcendental realm of being which we can posit, but we can't really say much about. Even saying that is saying too much. But from that radiates the nous, which is sort of the world mind, and then the world soul, and then we get down to where we are down here, the sense world. And Swedenborg is saying is that this language of correspondence, which he's taken up the challenge of bringing back into the world, it was known at an earlier time. It was known in a sort of golden age where people were naturally aware of it. It's only we, well, for him, it's, he's back in the 18th century, and for us, it's even got worse. It's even us today in the post-everything world, where we're even more further away from a kind of natural intuition of the language of correspondences. But at an earlier time, it seemed to be the case. At a kind of golden age, we can say, there was a time when it was more available. And this is something that we can find in other people as well that I've written about in my books, in which I've included them with Swedenborg in talking about these sorts of things. And this is Owen Barfield, who is not a Swedenborgian. He was, he was a brilliant writer and philosopher of language and literature. He was C.S. Lewis's great friend. He was one of the Inklings, C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, and others who all met at the pub in Oxford and talked about myth and poetry and all that. But he was also a follower of Rudolf Steiner. But Barfield talks about at an earlier time, when he looked through the history of language, language seemed to be saying at a much, much earlier time. The archaeology of language seems to suggest that human consciousness is one in which we saw the world in much more pictorial, kind of figurative kind of way. And he came to this conclusion basically by saying that the further back you go into language, it becomes more metaphorical. It becomes more figurative. It isn't prosaic as our language is. Our language is very, very prosaic. That's why we're very, very far from the law of correspondences. That's why anything like correspondences happens in poetry, let us say. It strikes us as strange and unusual. It sort of triggers an unusual experience of things. That's because our own natural way of seeing things isn't anything like that. But Barfield says, through history of language, you can see an earlier time. And this is something that also this fellow here, strangely enough, I mentioned Ovi de Lubitsch Milo. She got the de Lubitsch from this fellow here, R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch, who is a maverick French Egyptologist and also an alchemist. But he said that the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptian civilizations, whom he studied for many, many years and on site in places like Luxor and Karnak, he said that they possess something that he called the intelligence of the heart, which was, again, there was a symbolic way of understanding experience. It was a way of seeing the natural world around them as some way, not the flat, dead, static collection of things that we see it as, but as a much more living, organic, conscious kind of reality. And the Egyptians refer to it as netters, the gods, but they're again, the whole idea of a god is necessarily so anthropomorphic. It was a kind of inner kind of force that they could intuit. And this is something very much along the lines of the way in which I believe we can understand this notion of correspondence as being something that was more available at an earlier time. And so again, a rose is a rose, perhaps for Gertrude Stein, but it wasn't the case for Swedenborg, nor for these other fellows. Now, most readers, if they know about Swedenborg's correspondences, they come to them through his stories, his little vignettes about his adventures in heaven and hell. And he had adventures in other places as well. That was the title of a documentary that I was in about Swedenborg called Heaven, Hell, and Other Places. And as a spirit world, and he went to the other planets and so and so. But it was mostly heaven and hell that he collected the stories about here. And these are these little kind of sort of little traveler's tales, I'd say, that he used to kind of lighten the load of Arcana Coelestia, which is, what can I say? It's not the most immediately page-turning book, let's say. Perhaps I shouldn't be saying that to a cyber room full of Swedenborgians, but you can understand. And even Swedenborg did, and this is why he collected these sort of, likely tales of heaven and hell. And interesting thing about them is that although in one sense, heaven and hell are very, very, different places to what we experience here, they're very much the same. Angels in heaven, they go to work, they eat dinner, they're married, they belong to, groups, and, they do many of the things that we do here. And strangely enough, if some of Swedenborg's reports of this very robust afterlife, which was nothing like what William Blake said about the sort of standard notion of heaven, the theologians' notion of heaven, according to Blake, was an allegorical abode to which existence hath never come. And Swedenborg's heaven and hell is nothing like that. It's a very robust, real, 3D, HD, almost virtual reality kind of place, and you can walk and around it in there. You can probably get a little rough guide book, and we can look at his collection as a kind of rough guide to heaven and hell. And one of the things that struck me when I was reading that, and then I read quite a bit of other sort of related literature, some of the literature in spiritual texts, were two books in particular. Sir Oliver Lodge's book Raymond, that was written during World War I, and it's about his son. Sir Oliver Lodge, if you don't know, is a very important scientist in the early 20th century, but he was also one of the leading members of the Society of Psychical Research. And this was a book purporting to be spirit communications from Raymond, who died during the war, World War I, and he was saying what things were like in heaven. And it's a very robust concrete kind of heaven. People there wear robes, they ate, they smoked cigars, and they enjoyed the occasional whiskey and soda. So the idea that spirits can still drink spirits in the afterlife, no matter how, let us say, I don't know, odd it may be for us to envision it like that, that's nothing to sneeze at, I don't think. I think, you know, if I can look forward to that, it's okay. Even an even more kind of detailed look at the afterlife in a similar way. There's this book, Life Beyond Death with Evidence, by the Reverend Charles Drayton Thomas, and he talks about there being like a whole London. There's a whole London in the afterlife, and there's parks there, and there's roads, but they're not quite the same kind of roads. I think he means they're not quite, you know, they're not sort of tarred. The asphalt isn't put down there. But he says there's horses, dogs, cats, no snakes or lions, and regrettably, there was very few monkeys. So in his afterlife, I don't know why the absence of monkeys struck him as something to regret, but this was something that in that afterlife, I'm not quite sure. I'm tough in my head. I don't know if Swedenborg ever talks about animals in the afterlife. I don't know if do the angels have pets? I don't know. But so there's a kind of very visceral, robust, you know, this world, but only better. You know, imagine like a really here now, but only better. That party I've always wanted to get invited to. So that, there you are. And again, we may think, or some people may think, well, this is it's very nice, but it's a bit twee, isn't it? You know, it's kind of cute and all that. But this is part of Swedenborg's whole idea. I would say that the divine, the afterworld, God, it's he, she, it, whatever, is human. Or in the sense that, you know, we if we are made in his image or its image, then what we find in ourselves would be something that we will find there as well. This is to say that Swedenborg's divine is not the divine of the theologian or philosopher of religion, Rudolf Otto. You know, very famously, he said, you know, God is ganz andere. It's like totally other, wholly other. And you can understand that. You want God to be something that transcends the merely human. You know, we know the human limitations and all that. And a too human God would be a bit too cozy. But a God that's completely other, in a way, like the Neoplatonic one, or, you know, the other forms of this non-manifest transcendent realm. How could we possibly approach it? What do we do other than kind of cower in awe before its, you know, overpowering otherness? You know, for us to have any kind of relation to it, there must be something like that. That's why Swedenborg says that God, you know, in order to have any kind of contact with us, must take on some form that we can understand. And, you know, God is a human face, or Goddess has a human face. You know, it's, I mean, as far as I understand, God is neither body nor parts. This is just a concession to our weak human minds who need to be able to understand these things in a form that, you know, we can make some sense. And so this is the notion of the grand man, you know, the Homo Maximus. This is something that runs throughout Swedenborg's ideas. And again, it's the notion of correspondence, you know, how we are corresponds to the divine. And so it's something that, it's kind of reflection and reflection and reflection that enables the different levels of reality to communicate with each other. Now, Swedenborg says that he developed this whole notion of correspondence in order to be able to relate the true meaning of scripture. So he was performing a hermeneutic. He was doing what Henri Corbin will get onto later called tawil, which is a way in which you read the text, but you understand its deeper significance, just not just the surface level. And I mean, what I say in my little book is that he's in a long history of people that were doing that. The idea didn't come out of the blue to him, and he was well aware of others before that. We all know how well-read Swedenborg was, and we all know that he studied Kabbalah and things of that sort as well. So he was aware of these other traditions. And specifically, the idea of reading scripture in the symbolic way seems to start back in Alexandrian times, in the first couple centuries of the Christian era, in the ancient city of Alexandria, with people like Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Philo, the Jew, preceded them, and you also have Valentinus, Basil Valentinus. I don't know if he was in Alexandria, I think he was, but he was one of the Gnostics. And as far as I understand it, the reason why Clement and the other early church fathers like Origen start to become interested or want to promote this idea that of the need to understand scripture symbolically, not take it as a literal text, as a literal account of things, is that the Valentinus and the other Gnostics, they've been doing that. They have a more sophisticated way of reading the scripture. I mean, remember, whatever, the story of Christ, whatever was scripture was considered at the time, different texts. I mean, the Gnostics are producing their own texts, they have their own gospels and all that. Elaine Pagel's books, wonderful books about the whole early church. And I mean, they're fundamentally, they're basically saying, God, those well, I guess Petrine Christians who are taking it so literally, they just don't get it. It isn't this literal, factual reading of things like fundamentalists, let's say, read it today, or fundamentalists of any faith read their sacred scripts in a literal kind of way. No, it's there's different levels. There's different levels of interpretation, and there's different levels of interpretation because there's different levels of understanding. We're not all able to understand the deeper imports that the scripture, Jesus' teachings and so on, are communicating to us. And the Gnostics had like a sort of three-tiered sort of level. There was the hylic, which is hyle is a Greek word for this kind of unformed matter. It's just kind of stuff. And this is the literal kind of level, the physical level. Then I think there's the sort of, what do they call the psychic? And this is someone has an idea. Yes, there's some kind of message involved here. It's a story. It says a message. I'm not quite sure exactly what it is, but I'll accept that there's something there. And better that I follow these ideas than I don't. And then there's the pneumic or the pneumatic, and this is the one who really gets it. People who really get it, they really see on a higher level, pneuma is the soul and that kind of thing. And this is something that's similar, it starts to happen with Clement of Alexandria and Origen as well. They start to say, no, we have to read scriptures in this kind of way. And it's not only, oh, we got to do it because the Gnostics are doing it. It's like, well, they do understand that this is the case. And they all get it. Fundamentally, it seems Philo the Jew, who was doing this earlier, and he's reading the Old Testament. And he's saying that it's not a chronology, it's not a historical text. It's not like that. It's a sort of account of the soul. It's an account of the soul's journey, and we need to read it in that way. And also at the same time, I mean, I don't have a slide of them, but the Neoplatonic philosophers were around this time. The ones after Plotinus, because Plotinus is he's neat, he's very austere, and so there's no symbolism in him. It's all conceptual understanding. But the later ones like Proclus and Porphyry, they see the need for some kind. Not everybody can go into the stratosphere in the same way that Plotinus can. So they see it's a concession. They see the need for a kind of symbolic understanding, and they're not doing it with scripture. They're doing it with the Greek myths and Homer, things of that sort. And a more contemporary fellow over here is someone I don't think he's as well known in the Swedenborgian community that he perhaps should be, but this is Morris Snickel. And he's a very interesting fellow. He started out as a Jungian. He was one of the, he was Jung's lieutenant here, sort of right after World War I. And he wrote one of the first books about Jungian psychology in English. It was called Dream Psychology. But he sort of jumped ship with Jung in the early 20s and became a student of T.D. Uspensky, who was a Russian philosopher and writer who became the most known exponent of the ideas of the enigmatic Greco, we don't quite know exactly where he came from, esoteric teacher, Gurdjieff, who had his own ideas about what he called esoteric Christianity. And Uspensky wrote a remarkable chapter in his book, The New Model of the Universe, on a kind of esoteric reading of the New Testament. It's not Swedenborg's, but again, it's in that same area. And Nickel picked this up as well. And it's not as well known that he became very, very interested in Swedenborg's work, certainly in his later years. There's evidence that he was reading them earlier. But if you know Swedenborg's ideas, and if you know Jung's, and Nickel is most known for these 5 volumes of what he called the psychological commentaries on the work of Gurdjieff and Uspensky, and they're kind of sermons that he gave because he taught the fourth way. This is what the Gurdjieff system is known as. He taught that in the 30s and 40s and until his death in the early 50s here in England. And he gave these sort of weekly, they're more or less sermons. But if he doesn't name check either Jung or Swedenborg in them, but if you know, because I've written about Jung and Swedenborg. When I was reading the commentaries, I saw, oh, that's a Swedenborgian idea. Oh, that's Jung. So he incorporates their ideas into this fourth way stuff. So it's an interesting mix. But he too wrote, well, he left one unfinished, but 2 books. One is called The New Man, and the other is called The Mark. And The New Man specifically is about an esoteric, symbolic reading of the Gospels, and how much his take on it was influenced by Swedenborg's. Well, I guess there's some Swedenborgian scholars out there and Nickel scholars out there working on that. But having said this about, the kind of background, the historical background, let's say, that Swedenborg found himself in, this current, we know that, he has his own particular way of understanding these things. And as I said at the beginning of this talk, you probably know that better than I do. It's interesting to me that, and in a way, and I'll just say this here in a way, I mean, if you stick with the strict Swedenborgian take on the correspondence, it becomes kind of a sign system. This means that, this means that, this means that kind of thing. And it's perhaps understandable and it's coherent and it works. But it then becomes kind of a very, kind of, how should we say it? Again, more of a sign than a symbol, because I guess the symbol always has something, there's always something left out that you can't quite put your finger on. There's something hovering around it that gives it this mysterious kind of character. And this is what the correspondence will turn into later on in a cultural kind of context. But having said that, so how did Swedenborg understand, the correspondences? And I'll just take a very, very simple example here, and we'll talk about the sun. But one of the things that we have to say is that, again, not everybody's way of understanding scripture or anything else symbolically, reading the world symbolically, they're not the same. We know that, I said, just take Blake, for example. Blake argued with Swedenborg. Maybe not so much about his interpretation of scripture in their kind of attitude. But in any case, so Swedenborg takes something like the sun, okay? So the sun in the physical realm, it produces light and warmth. And we know without it, life would not exist. And so it's the fundamental necessity for life as we know it. But in the spiritual realm, the spiritual sun that William Blake claimed to have seen at the top of Primrose Hill, which is not far from where I live here, it performs a similar but different kind of function. And Swedenborg says the sun is a source of divine love and wisdom, or divine love and understanding, in the sense that the physical warmth that we feel is the warmth of love, the loving warmth. And even our language says that, if you've warmed up to somebody, somebody's got a warm heart, And if you really believe in something, you put your heart into it. He lost heart and all that. So all this sort of thing. We know it's got nothing to do with just pumping the blood. It's got something to do with this other kind of wider kind of meaning. And likewise with understanding. If you understand something, you saw the light. You want to learn about something, you wish to be enlightened about it. If somebody's really smart, we say they're brilliant. And so on and so on. Swedenborg belonged to a whole culture of movement that was known as the Enlightenment later on. And so we have in our own language, you already understand in a way that we probably don't reflect on that this is something that's happening. And again, this relates to this notion mentioned before about how for Swedenborg, the divine is human. There's a reciprocal relationship. It's not something that's totally different. It's William James says this later on. He says that he feels his consciousness, his inner being, is connected to something larger than him that isn't radically different than him, but it's different. It's bigger, but it's not radically different. And Swedenborg calls this the Homo Maximus, the great man, and we find it in Adam Kadmon, in Kabbalah, and we find it in various other traditions as well. And we can find, as we say, reflections of this notion in other kind of areas. So the sort of reiterative, what do you want to call it? The kind of reiterative character of Swedenborg's kind of anthropomorphic cosmology. I can find sort of similarities in, say, the work of David Bohm, who talks about there's the implicate order and the explicate order. The explicate order is the world that we see out here, but it all relates to and depends upon a deeper order that is not immediately manifest, but it gives rise to that, much in the same way that Swedenborg says that the natural world wouldn't exist for a second if the spiritual world wasn't, sort of radiating it out. And again, we have the reiterative structure in things like fractals, things of that sort. Where, larger structures turn out to be basically, magnifications of smaller ones and so on and so on. And, if Swedenborg's works on anatomy and things like that, he talks about similar kind of pictorial, figurative ways of understanding, blood and veins and things of that sort. And again, in larger traditions that Swedenborg was aware of, probably the most, the most concise kind of way, axiom of expressing the notion of correspondence comes not from Swedenborg, but from the Hermetic tradition. This is a picture of Hermes Trismegistus, thrice greatest Hermes, who was once considered an actual person, but subsequently came to be understood as a mythological one, or the pseudonym of a group of people who were around the same time as the Gnostics. They were Hermeticists, but we don't know who they are. We don't know the names of any of them. But the saying, as above, so below, you can't get more concise than that in trying to express the notion of correspondence. What happens here in this realm is related to what happens above, and this is encapsulated, and this is an engraving of what's known as the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus.
We have about 5 minutes left.
5 minutes left. Okay. All right. I'll have to move on a bit quicker here. So, all right. So, okay. There's two levels of correspondence that the scholar of Western esotericism, Anton Fevre, said. There's a natural correspondence. We were just talking about that, as above, so below. That's behind astrology and alchemy and magic and all that, where colors and plants and times of day and different stars were all related in this kind of system of correspondence. But the one that Swedenborg was more interested in was this kind of spiritual textual correspondence, understanding the meaning of the text. We mentioned Henri Corbin before, and his notion of a spiritual hermeneutics, and this is what he calls tawil, where the surface, which is called, the batin, which is the esoteric meaning, the surface is called zahir. You're able to read through the surface to get to the center. And someone that Corbin wrote about quite a bit, and also he wrote about Swedenborg, was the Persian 12th century Persian mystic Suhrawardi, who, like Swedenborg, took these journeys into not so much heaven and hell, but similar interior realms. And this is what Corbin called, later he called the imaginal. And he relates Suhrawardi's inner journeys, which are related in a Persian Neoplatonic, Gnostic terminology to Swedenborg's as well. And what Corbin says, and what seems to be the case with many of these people, is the best time to try to do this is in this intermediary state between sleeping and waking, known as the hypnagogic state, which we're very lucky to move in and out of at least twice a day. You know, when we fall asleep and we wake up. And Swedenborg, as far as I understand, at least according to the evidence of Wilson van Dusen in his wonderful book, The Presence of Other Worlds, is one of the first books I read back in the early 80s about Swedenborg, that Swedenborg apparently was able to stay in that state for quite some time. Others, similarly, Jung, if you know Jung's work, he went through what he called his night sea journey, which was a kind of psychic breakdown after his breakup with Freud, in which he too went on these interior journeys into what he later called the collective unconscious. And if you know his Red Book, he depicts, he has account of his journeys there. Someone else who took an interior journey, Aldous Huxley, and he famously, his book Doors Perception, title comes from Blake. The follow-up book Heaven and Hell comes from Swedenborg. And he talks about his experiences on mescaline and other various forms of altering his consciousness. He says he discovered a kind of unmapped inner Borneos and Amazon forests. He's writing about this in the 50s, so these places were still strange. That had its own flora and fauna and their own inhabitants. This is something that Jung discovered as well, and Suhrawardi. You meet people in these places and they talk to you as the angels talked to Swedenborg. And someone else who similarly, Rudolf Steiner, he was someone else who was able to enter these hypnagogic states for long periods, and when he read the Akashic record, and so and so. So just to try to get to where things went wrong with Baudelaire, maybe 2 minutes extra. What happened, and one of the things that everybody talks about that I've been talking about here, is they say there's a need for responsibility imagination, because these inner realms, they, how should we say it, they don't necessarily stay there. They can go out into the world. And we know that. Swedenborg says, you know, heaven and hell are psychological states that we inhabit and we project out into the world. This out picturing. The world that we see around us is projection of our inner states. And what Corbin and Barfield and so many others I was talking about, they were concerned that with the loss of the kind of traditional cosmology, the hierarchy of being, into a kind of just, everything is kind of flat, horizontal being, the imagination would just kind of erupt into a kind of anything goes kind of strange world. And, you know, just very quickly, you know, I'm not going to name any names, but these are some, you know, more or less representative examples of the eruption of the imagination. So wrong turn at Baudelaire. Okay, well, Baudelaire got most of his Swedenborg from Balzac, who talks about it in 2 novels, Seraphita. Someone should reprint it because it's a gender swapping story, and it would very much along the lines of what's happening today. And he got, you know, the idea of Correspondences from reading that, and then he blended it with the work of 2 other contemporaries. One was the German writer E.T.A. Hoffmann. And if you know your music, you know, most people know of Hoffmann from Offenbach and Tchaikovsky, but he was a writer of many, many strange, weird stories and a fantastic music critic. But he also was very interested in this idea of synesthesia. And what is synesthesia? That's when one sense does the work of the other. So you taste a color, or you might smell a sound or something like that. And he was someone who experienced this a lot. And he said whenever he smelled marigolds, he heard an oboe. So there's a direct relationship between the smell of the flower and the sound. And he has a character in one of his stories, Kapellmeister Chrysler, who wears a coat, and the coat is in C major, but the collar is in E minor. So his coat is in a certain kind of musical state. And so it gives you the strange idea that things are not as solid and stable as they are, they blend. And then Poe was an absolute fanatic about, Baudelaire was an absolute fanatic about Poe. And Poe was very interested. He didn't read so much Swedenborg, but he read about Mesmer. And one of the first stories that Baudelaire translated of Poe's, because Baudelaire was known more as a translator of Poe before he became known as a poet, was a story called Mesmeric Revelations. And this is supposed to be an account of someone who's dying but under a mesmeric trance and kept alive, and they give an account of the spirit world. And the story is that when some Swedenborgians at the time read the story, they couldn't believe it, and because to them it was like spot on, he got it. So they wrote to Poe and said, how did you know this and all that? And he said, oh, I just made it up, which is typical of Poe. But what Baudelaire got from Poe is this notion that the poet is a kind of seer. The poet is a kind of mystic who can read the signs. And if you know Poe's story, The Purloined Letter, the punchline of it is that there's a document that's been stolen and the police can't find it. And so they have to go to this kind of pre-Sherlock Holmes kind of detective who wears dark glasses at night and smokes funny tobacco, and it is very, very strange kind of characters of a poet. But he finds the thing, and the reason he can find it is that it's out in plain sight. It isn't hidden at all. But his superior senses and his superior perceptions can detect what everyone else can't see, what's invisible in plain sight. So Poe took all that and turned the correspondences, instead of being that way, turned them that way. And then we have symbolism, correspondences, but not as Swedenborg knew it. And you have the rise of symbolism. So you have, Wagner, the Gesamtkunstwerk, where all different forms of, art were blended together, just like the different senses are blended in the synesthesia. And, paintings like Gustav Moreau, Rimbaud's famous poem Vowels, where the different vowels are different colors, Maeterlinck's play, The Bluebird, and an actual reader of Swedenborg. Swedenborg saved his life, Strindberg. Strindberg felt he was under attack by some evil theosophists in the early 19th century, and he said that reading Swedenborg got him away. So there you go. Maybe we took a wrong turn at Baudelaire, but what is lost, what is forgotten can be remembered, and what is lost can be found. And I hope I've been able to stimulate your memories a bit here. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Gary. The powers that be were so stimulated and saw the terrific comments coming in chat and other ways. The tremendous enjoyment of people. They gave us 10 more minutes, so we've got 6 minutes left, and we'll do a question and possibly 2. So one question comes from Eric Hoffman in Minnesota, one of our ministers. He wonders if you would make any distinction between symbolism and correspondences. Is a correspondence and a symbol, are they synonyms? Would you parse it in any kind of way?
Well, I mean, as I said, Swedenborg there's a specific one-to-one relationship. Is it George Nicholson has a sort of, dictionary of correspondence or something where it gives you the one-to-one. But a symbol does correspond. So there's a specific, how should we say, vocabulary of correspondence for Swedenborg, but then the way a symbol works is that it corresponds to something.
Right, the precision in co-responding. Very nice. One more question. We have an author out here in the San Francisco Bay Area, Burl Walsh, asks if you see correspondence, or did Swedenborg see correspondence as a way to permit actual communication upwards towards the beyond, towards the divine? Is there something kind of functional and physical in physics that we can ride in some sort of way?
Well, my understanding is that Swedenborg considered himself an exception in the sense that he was given this task to understand this and then to communicate it. And what his readers, I guess the idea is readers, they understood it, then they would live their lives according to, well, I guess what you guys are trying to do, and other people out there that do that. But my understanding is that it wasn't sort of like, you can do this too, sort of thing. Whereas like in some other schools, you can practice Maybe I'm wrong, but you can practice certain techniques and exercises, and the idea is to try to have the same experience. So, but I mean, there's nothing stopping you from taking this idea of correspondence and actually trying to apply it in a certain way. And as I said, some of the people I talked about, Corbin, Goethe, they took the principle that, the natural world is symbolic of something else. It's a language. So in a way, I would just go with that rather than like, oh, let me memorize what all the symbols are. Go with that notion, have a kind of encounter with that thing and see what rises up in you.
Well, a tremendous and hearty expression of gratitude from all of us for being with us today. It's been extremely delightful and illuminating. Many have been saying that. So we're very blessed to have you share your thoughts and your writings with us. And now I believe it's cocktail hour in England.
Well, I'm gonna have something to eat, but no, thank you so much. I'm sorry I went over and there wasn't time for enough questions, but I'd be happy to, come back another time and we can carry on.
I can send a few on email that has the email of the person who asked the question.
Or if there's something that's pressing, yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
All right, lovely. Well, thank you again. Thank you so much. And again, it was wonderful to be on. And I look forward, to talking to you again sometime. Yeah. Bye-bye.